Um, so this is my first book. It's about 6 or 7 years in the making. I had no idea when I started it that it was going to be, that I would finish it. I'd written other stuff before, but I'd never succeeded in finishing a book. And it's sort of newsworthy right now because of the anniversary of the war. It sort of ties in. And people ask me, I went on tour in Germany because the book came out first in Germany, whether I had planned for the book to come out on the 100th anniversary of World War I, but that seems really laughable because not only did I not plan for it to come out in this year, but I had no plans that it would ever be published or anything like that would happen. It's about a young American who wants to maybe heir to the fortune of a British mountaineer and his lover. So if the American can prove that he's related to these people, then he can inherit the money. So the story switches back and forth between him going around Europe and searching and the past itself. So a good deal of the book takes place in 1916 and 1924. And I was kind of obsessed with history, and it just sort of came out of things that I was already interested in. So because the war is, I'll talk first. I'll do first a little reading. The main reading I'll do is a war scene because I do think it's kind of pertinent, and you guys will probably be hearing about it. So in July, and especially because this festival is really, in a sense, politically motivated, and it's about sort of being engaged with the world and world literature. I think it's important, at least for me, to tie my book into something that's meaningful to talk about the war. In July, it'll be the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the war, when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated and all of Europe sort of plunged into this catastrophe. My book was sort of an effort. I mean, the wars that exist in my book is only sort of is experienced by two people, because no matter how big a historical event is, I think it doesn't feel like history when it's happening, and I tried to show what it feels like on a human scale, and a human perspective. So in this case, the scene I'm going to read, there's a character named Ashley who's a mountaineer, and like a lot of these soldiers, he wasn't a professional soldier. You didn't fight then because I mean there were professional soldiers, but a lot of those people were killed very early on in the war. And these guys, this wasn't what he cared about. He found himself. It wasn't his goal to be at the Somme in 1916, but he was there because he had to be. And the scene that I read is sort of the first scene in the book where he's there, and it shows what it was like. I don't know, it's about a wounded German, and I don't know if it's out of masochism or what, but I read this chapter everywhere I went in Germany about this day. So you can think about that. And you can imagine me reading this with a sort of German audience all staring at me like I'm a crazy person. And I'll read this and I'll read one other part. 5th of October, 1916, Resolve Trench, Somme, France. There are 1,000 kinds of weapons here, and Ashley has seen them all. When they're in a museum one day, he thinks, they will know how we went back to the Middle Ages. But Ashley had seen medieval weapons in the Tower of London, and even the poorest had been finer and cleaner tools than some in this war. The dugout is lit by a single candle set on an empty wine bottle on the table. Beside the table are a pair of upturned crates serving as stools. A few pictures have been tacked to the dugout walls, photographs of actresses torn from the illustrated papers. Ashley rinses his mouth with his canteen and takes his pistol from its holster, the oily barrel still warm to the touch. He sets the pistol on the table, but he does not reload it. Fully clothed, Ashley lies down on one of the makeshift bunks. 2 nets of chicken wire hung on a wooden frame. A muddy blanket lies beneath him. He pulls an overcoat over his body and tries to sleep. 3 days ago, the Berkshires had launched an attack in this sector, but the Germans had repelled them with intense artillery and machine gun fire. The Germans had rallied in a counterattack that ended with desperate hand-to-hand fighting here at Resolve Trench. Since then, there had been many wounded stranded in the shattered forest of no man's land just beyond the British wire. By now, most of those had died or been brought in, but there remained one wounded German who had been weeping and raving all the while. He was still alive. He lay less than 20 yards from the British frontline trench. Ashley was the only man in the company who understood German. He had been listening to the wounded man for 3 days. The German passed between periods of lucidity and great delirium. At times, he seemed to be dictating a letter to his wife, telling her that he was ready to die. At times, he addressed the British directly, describing his wounds in detail, describing the shell hole he lay in, saying that he was running out of water, but could survive if only they would bring him in. He explained that he had no quarrel with the English. They were all brothers in God's kingdom. Except for the word camaraderie, which the German repeated over and again. The British understood none of this. The men nicknamed the wounded German Kameraden. One of the oldest men in the platoon, a soft-spoken postman called Stuart, had actually gone over the top at night to bring in Kameraden, but the Germans had seen him in the moonlight and began strafing him with machine gun fire. Stuart crawled back to the trench without ever seeing Kameraden. Against all expectations, Kameraden lived on, moaning all the while. He quoted popular songs or nursery rhymes or folk ballads, but mostly he recited poetry. Kameraden knew prodigious amounts of poetry, and Ashley wondered if he was a schoolmaster or a professor or even a poet himself, though he doubted the last. The German quoted whole long epics he knew by heart, and even the denser men could tell these were poems from the rhythm of the words or the patterns of the rhymes. Ashley recognized only a few. Goethe's Minionsgesang, some verses by Heinrich Heine. One morning at dawn's stand to, Ashley was astonished to hear what he believed to be a German translation of Byron's She Walks in Beauty, but the man fell into weeping before it was completed. Late last night, as Ashley was on watch, Kameraden's moaning reached a fevered crescendo. The men sleeping on the trench floor complained of the noise. A few of them yelled at the German to shut up, but this brought further cries of protest from the other Berkshires along the line. Ashley told the men to go back to sleep. He found Bradley, the platoon sergeant, and told him he was going into no man's land to see Kameraden. "It's hopeless, sir. You can't save him. The Huns might see you." "I know," Ashley said, "but I can't stand it any longer." Ashley pulled a pair of thick toeless stockings over his knees and elbows, then checked the cartridges in his revolver cylinder. He traveled north along the trench to get closer to Kameraden, stepping over men sleeping in niches in the wall, or wrapped in capes on the muddy trench floor. They groaned in half-sleep and rolled in the mud. Ashley trudged up to the forward sap nearest Kameraden, really only a fortified shell hole, holding a sentry and a few flares. The sentry jerked to the side when he saw Ashley, swiveling his rifle and then lowering it. "Thought you was a German, sir. Can't hear nothing over that blubbering." "Certainly not." "You understand German, don't you, sir? What's he moaning on about?" "He wants us to kill him." Ashley saw the outline of the sentry's helmet move from side to side as he shook his head. His face was sheathed in blackness. "He never said that before, did he, sir?" "No. I'm going over. Don't fire unless they open upon me, and only then well to the left. 11 o'clock at the farthest, you hear? I shan't be far off." Ashley rinsed his mouth from his canteen and spat into the mud. He stepped on the crude fire step, peering over the rim of the parapet. Ashley climbed over. On elbows and knees, he zigzagged through the British wire to the morass of no man's land. His chin trailed in the mud. It took 20 minutes to go 30 yards. The stench was rich and sweet, decaying corpses and chloride of lime. He ascended the realm of a huge shell crater and floundered over. Inside there was a mound of dead Highland soldiers in muddied kilts and knee socks. Ashley rested here and studied the terrain. The German was still wailing away, his voice hoarse. The sound was coming from the right. Ashley crawled farther until the sound was very close. He flopped into another large shell hole. He saw Kameraden's murky silhouette a few yards away, but Ashley was afraid the German might have a weapon, so he lay in silence, waiting. After a few minutes, a flare went up over no man's land, and the scene was illuminated. Kameraden was a plump corporal from a Jaeger regiment, known as forest hunters and expert riflemen. He was on his back, his tunic soaked with black blood where shrapnel had perforated his chest. His eyes were open, but his face was turned up to the sky, watching the flare sink through the darkness. He was holding a water bottle in one hand and clutching his wounds with the other. Ashley crawled beside Kameraden and spoke softly in German. At first, the man barely seemed to notice, perhaps mistaking him for a hallucination. He breathed in a terrible sucking wheeze. Suddenly the German's head bolted and turned. He begged for water. He said his own canteen was empty and he'd already drunk all the water in the shell hole. Ashley took his water bottle from his waist and poured it onto Kameraden's cracked lips. Kameraden gulped feverishly, muttering something indecipherable. Ashley heaved the German onto his back and began carrying him towards the British line, crouching as low as he could. Kameraden whined in pain. He was very heavy. Ashley could feel the man's blood dripping down his neck into his shirt, and it was hard to crouch with the weight of the body upon him. The mud sucked back at each step. Ashley lost his balance and dropped Kameraden. The German moaned as Ashley lifted him again. It took 10 minutes just to get out of the crater. A machine gun burst open on the German side. The British returned a few sharp rifle rounds. Then a Lewis gun began rattling to Ashley's right. He would never get Kameraden all the way to his own trench. He went on forward anyway, the German raving with the pain of movement. It took 20 minutes to reach the shell hole full of dead Highlanders. They went over the lip, and Kameraden slipped from Ashley's grasp and rolled to the bottom. Ashley pulled Kameraden's face out of the mud and propped him up. The man was in delirium again. He was talking to his wife, the mud trickling down his face. Ashley cursed and drew his revolver. He stepped back and tried to level his pistol at the German's bare head. He pulled the trigger, but his hand was shaking. The bullet clipped the man's scalp, tearing off a chunk. He moaned and whimpered, raising his hands above his face as if the flesh of his palms were any protection. Ashley moved closer and fired again. The bullet tore through Kamaradin's finger and went into his eye. There was much blood. Kamaradin slumped over. Ashley crouched in the shell hole and watched another flare go up. A German machine gun was traversing the horizon wildly. A few grenades went off in the distance. Ashley bent over the mud and vomited his supper. It had been biscuits and bully anyway, and he was sick of biscuits and bully. Ashley spat and drained his canteen with a long drink. He waited half an hour until the guns went silent. He crawled slowly back to the forward sap and tumbled in beside the sentry. I don't know why I choose to read such funny stuff. Well, that was already really long, so I'll just read one brief little thing, maybe, that's less depressing.
How did that go over in Germany?
Oh, they loved it. They loved it. I mean, no, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, they were all like, we need to read the love story. Let's read the love story. And I read the love story, and I was like, this is so boring. I don't want to read the love story. You guys can read the love story. There's an actor to perform parts of it. So the actor would do the love story. The parts of it would be in German, and parts of it I would read in English. So towards the end, I kind of cut it up, because that was actually only like part of that scene. But it's, I don't know why I'm so attached to that scene, but I should probably not show my weirdness to other people. All right. I'll just read this. This is a letter from Everest. So Ashley gets to Everest later. Chobuk, 26th of April, 1924. He's writing, I should say, to Imogen, a woman he hasn't seen in 10 years. My dear Imogen, I've seen it now. I had to write you straight away. Last night we stayed at Pangwa below the high pass. We struck camp in darkness this morning and had not gone far before Hugh took me ahead of the party, at double pace and then nearly gasping until we crested the pass, dizzy and gasping on its summit. It was a spectacular vision, layer upon layer of dark barren hills, the jagged teeth of the Himalaya towering above, Makalu and Lhotse and Cho Oyu, all seeming to bend towards a pink sky, the sunrise dazzling their western flanks. One peak reigned above all, cruel and exquisite, a hurricane of vapor streaming over his summit. It was Everest, as exquisite as a tiger's fang, and as tempting as black oblivion, for she stood miles tall, and still I felt I was looking into an abyss. She seemed the remnant of some other world, a place elemental and unforgiving, that left behind this mountain, to prove his trifles before the wild and howling universe. I waited for Hugh to speak, but he only took out the field glasses, and we scanned the upper mountain for what seemed hours, searching for flattish places to pitch our high camp, imagining obstacles among specks of rock 35 miles distant. We shall soon get a better view. We are 3 days' march from our base camp, and the sight of Everest puffed life into our tired party, although already the wind pushed much of it back out. We are camped among the willows of Chobuk Monastery. The tent walls wet against my head, and I hold frequently to grease my face from a little pot that stays beside me all night. For the Tibetan plain has broken my skin raw, which is never made for such a hostile climate. All the other sahibs have grown beards against the wind, but my attempt was pitiable, and I gave it up. On a bench outside, Mills wrenches away at the oxygen kit by hurricane lamp. Over in the mess tent, Price and the colonel debate the plans and personnel for the summit assault. A runner is departing with the dispatches, so I end here. The post caught us at Shegar, and though I truly didn't expect anything, still I stood beside the mailbag like a boy, remembering a parcel that came to me one day at the Somme, a place wetter than here, but no more hospitable. I felt then, I feel now, beyond the pale on the far side of every river and boundary that divides civilization from emptiness. But I had you then. I had the parcel in my hands, a long walk back to the hut in the rain, where there would be no dry clothes and never any time to sleep. It didn't matter. I was young and we were together. The post goes out now. Yours ever, Ashley. Okay. Questions? You can ask anything you want. I read crazy parts that don't have anything to do with the plot of the book in a way, but the majority of the book really does take place in the past. So it's quite boring until you get the premise, and if you already know it, I thought that was more exciting.
I was interested in the very last section when you're in the eastern part of Iceland. And there's this wonderful last line of that particular chapter where he says, I go through the door. And then, of course, there's a huge mystery as to what happened after that.
Right.
Which we have to figure out for ourselves.
Yeah, nobody likes figuring out mysteries for themselves.
That's sometimes better than...
Well, the thing is, so the book doesn't have like a really neatly tied up ending, and I actually think there's not that much ambiguity to the ending of the book, but it's, I think people are really conditioned to like stories. I mean, as human beings, we're all really interested in stories, and you can get people to read a really boring 500-page book like this just by getting them interested in the first 5 pages. I think there's something natural in humans that we want to know what happens, and by like not showing everything on the page, I think you can be frustrated. But I find that by the end of the book, this book is sort of based on mystery. I mean, mystery is almost the starting point of the book. The mystery of 1924 Everest expedition is that nobody knows whether George Mallory was actually the first to summit. I mean, there was a huge mystery when they went there at the time. Nobody had even set foot within 100 miles of Everest. The war itself was actually really mysterious. If you read the poems of Wilfred Owen, mystery is sort of at the heart of it. I mean, it was a mysterious war where you did not see the enemy. You almost never saw the Germans. So for me, the book wasn't about solving them, but at the same time, I didn't. It's not that I don't think or have an idea of what happens. It's more that I felt like by not tying up the ends, it allowed people to have their own personal interpretation of the ending. And also, in a way, I almost feel like something that's not fully closed goes on and has more of a life. I just read The Goldfinch, which I really enjoyed, and I was talking about it the other day with somebody, and I was like, I haven't thought about that book since I finished it 2 weeks ago, even though I read it. It's a really long book. And it's not because I don't think it's a good book, but part of it was that the ending was so neat that I wasn't thinking about what happened. And then, so when people and some of the people in Germany were like, oh my God, what's in the ending? And I'm like, you're still thinking about it. That's awesome. if I had written that one chapter you wanted, you would just have shut the book, put it on the shelf, and never thought about it ever again.
What took you to the First World War?
A lot of things. I think it was not like a deliberate effort, but I had just been interested in it since I was a kid. I read All Quiet on the Western Front when I was 13 years old, and I think, in a way, that the war is a sort of nightmare of the early 20th century, and it's the meeting point of this old world and the new. So all these technologies that people had, that had been in development, it seemed like the world was going towards progress, and it would actually have been quite normal to believe that everything was getting better, and then suddenly this thing happened. And I think I was fascinated by the world of these people who spoke in this beautiful sort of Edwardian dialect, and yet were suddenly confronted with the machinery turning against them. But I was reading letters, in particular the letters of Wilfred Owen, and I found them incredibly beautiful, and I got really interested in what these people's personal lives had been like. And then I realized that all of the people on the 20s Everest expeditions had been in the war, which was really weird because the war was itself the Everest expeditions were so much like war in a way that I wondered why they had done this. And yet they wrote about climbing as this. And even, the war letters are really beautiful. And I think my attraction to their language and trying to replicate their language was part of, the initial challenge of writing the book. So I read a lot of letters to try to kind of get to speak their language, I guess you'd say.
It was interesting that a lot of great war poems came out of that time. I mean, there aren't a lot of great war poems that came out of the Vietnam War or even the Second World War in the same kind of way as...
No, and in
the
fact,
depth of stuff that came out of the First War.
Exactly. I mean, they say that our idea of war poetry is based on that war. And in a way, I think that is partly because of the shock, of the newness of it, the fact that it had to be created. These poets, the poetry was invented during the war by the people who were writing it. Wilfred Owen did not enter the war a war poet at all. His stuff completely changed, and he really only changed it, when he met Sassoon and stuff. This all happened in the last, year or two of his life, and he only practiced it for a brief period of time. But I think that spontaneity of it, and also the meeting point between this old world and the new, I think it was a special moment. But I also think that the war itself is kind of like it stands as a symbol almost for modern war, and in that sense, it's really good for. The poetry is so effective because when we think of war, in a way, you think of something like the First World War. Any other questions?
Could you tell us a little bit about the research that you did?
Yeah. So I started doing research at the beginning, and the research kind of like went on until the very end. I actually was doing research for this, like when the book was still in copy editing. I was still going to the British Library and stuff. It was really ridiculous. So initially, I went to Berlin to write the book, and I went there with a bunch of suitcases full of books, which was really stupid because I then realized that I could have just bought them all from Amazon.uk. But then, I also realized after a while that like traditional history books were not of much use because you don't really need to know like vast historical trends. It's actually useful when you're talking about it to people to have the context, but the context didn't matter that much for these people. You need social context. You need to understand what people's lives were like. So half of the research was really details about specific things, like what did taxi cabs look like in London in 1916, or what did the equipment on Everest look like. But the harder thing is actually knowing what people were like and how they spoke and what they cared about, especially moral values or class distinctions. Like what would it be like to get pregnant when you were not married at that time? It's a very sticky situation, and the gradations of class, I think they're pretty complicated, actually. Like, you could say that upper middle class people could do this, but then aristocrats seem to do whatever they want and sleep with everybody and have all kinds of illegitimate children. So you have to place everybody so specifically. So getting to know the people was probably the biggest challenge. That, and of course, like when you're writing something like The War, Everest, it's such a specific moment that I just felt a lot of pressure to get it right. Because it was, even though the battle in this is somewhat fictionalized, basically it's not really, and it has to be accurate. So I wrote those parts last, pretty much, especially the war stuff. But yeah, I mean, some things, but there'd be weird convergences on some things where like what you imagined would be kind of like what you thought it was like. Last summer I was in London with my girlfriend, and I was researching one thing in one place, and she was doing something else somewhere else. And I asked her to help me by going and looking up how much the YWCA cost in 1916 to stay for one night. And I had just written 2 shillings because I had just made it up based on what I thought the value of the currency was. And she was there. She was very sweet. She got really into it, and she was like, "Oh my God, I found this book. I found their newsletter. I found this and that." And she did all this stuff. And after two days of research, she came back and she was like, "Well, I think I couldn't find a nightly rate, but I think it was about 14 shillings a week, so it would be 2 shillings." And I was like, "That's what's in there." And she's like, "Yeah, I guess you shouldn't change it then." And I was like, she's like, "It might be 3. So, I mean, but that kind of thing would make me feel like I was getting it right. Or imagining something and then seeing it. I would read a letter I'd never read before and see that the characters had ordered creme de menthe or something, or creme de cassis, some drink in a cafe, and then had gone for a walk and something, lost their key or something, and I'd be like, well, I already wrote this and I hadn't seen this letter before, so it must be some convergence of things that I imagined with the real world, and that was a good sign, I hoped.
Sounds like the scientific method proving a hypothesis.
Yeah, well, lucky for you, nobody can really prove you wrong. I mean, the thing is, when the British, the books published in England, and the British were like, "Oh, we will have some corrections," and they were always telling me that they were going to have corrections to my dialogue or whatever. And then finally, I was like, "What are the corrections?" And my editor sent me 3 things. It was not that many, but part of the thing is that in the case of the dialogue of the characters, I mean, this civilization is gone. Like, those people are, there's their letters, but that doesn't even prove how they really spoke. But, these people were born in 1896 or something like that. I mean, they're gone. And so it's archaeology. I mean, the way that Kate Middleton or whoever talks doesn't necessarily indicate how these people talked or whatever. So it's kind of comforting to know that nobody can say you're totally wrong.
If the history is what fascinated you, I'm curious about where sort of the seed of the book came from. Was it, I want to write historical fiction set in this time, or was it the story that came to mind?
Yeah, it was a story. I mean, I guess I just had, I don't think of myself as a historical novelist, but I'm really interested in I guess I'm kind of interested in extremes, which is what the book's about, the war on Everest and stuff. But I also I'm looking at stuff all the time, and I'm thinking about history. And I guess the plot of the book was in a way if you look at buildings all the time and you're always thinking about what happened there, history starts to feel like this really dormant thing. And I got really interested in what would it be like if history was not so dormant, if something came from the past and had some active, went out to grab you and had some active force over it. So in this sense, that's basically what the lawyers are all about. And the lawyers coming to this American guy and being like, there's a fortune. Suddenly the past is exerting influence. And I think the past does exert influence on us, but normally we don't know about it. So what Tristan's doing in this book is what I find really interesting, is trying to figure out what would it be like if you wanted to know exactly how you came to be. Because we're all kind of a product of a bunch of weird coincidences or like chance meetings. If you think about all the chance meetings that happen to be stacked up to like put us here, it's incredible. Like my parents met because my mom put an ad for a Japanese tutor in a college newspaper in New Mexico. But that's just one of like this like entire pyramid of things that like stretches on and on. And so in this book, what Tristan is trying to find out about is, what if you just took this like the one moment where it was like the most unlikely that these two people would come together? And in this moment, it's just 6 days, but this kind of decides, this whole layer of events at the bottom. And so I guess all these ideas about that got mixed up with the history stuff that I was interested in. But I wouldn't say that that's just quite history. I guess it's also an obsession with kind of like fate and chance and the way that our lives are corrected.